Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of our conference, The Holodomor and Global Perspective. Thanks to all of you who joined us yesterday and those on Zoom who sat in different time zones watching our panels and offering comments. We have another day of panels for you, and we're going to get going now with our first one, which is our 4th panel of the conference on the materiality of the Holodomor. Our panelists today are Sara Nesteruk, Iryna Skubii, who will be joining us via Zoom, Larysa Zasiekina, and our discussant Paul Minnis, who also will be joining us by Zoom. So now I will turn it over to our first panelist, Sara.
Thank you, and thank you to both Daria and John for this amazing conference and for the invitation to speak. So welcome to my presentation. My title is Recipes for Baking Bread, Stories from Holodomor, and my name's Dr. Sara Nesteruk. This paper explores my practice-based PhD research in 3 parts: maps, poetry, and recipes for baking bread. My final project is 5 short films exploring stories from Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. My first section explores geographies and stories appearing from maps, physical landscapes and memories. Forensic architecture are a group of academic and artistic investigators working at Goldsmiths, University of London. One of their research methods is uses of cartographic regression. Quote, "Cartographic regression refers to the process of using historic surveys, maps, and aerial photographs overlaid on contemporary imagery," end quote. This particular project is exploring stories from Death Valley in Louisiana. This image is from an exhibition at the Whitworth Gallery, Cloud Studies, in 2021. This project explores stories of one specific location through slave trade, photochemical industries, and current residential neighborhoods. Using data across space and time, these artists map histories of maps using physical landscapes to tell stories of one area. I use this practice in my research exploring histories from Ukraine. One part of my project is an exploration of a collection of letters from an engineer from South Africa, Jerry Berman. These letters were presented to me by an independent writer, Alison Marshall, from a family collection. Berman's letters were written to Marshall's grandparents, Maya and Sonia Forte. They are in English and have no censoring. Berman describes conditions in Ukraine where he was working during Holodomor. Part of my work with Alison is digitizing and archiving this collection. I use fragments, stories, experiences, quotes and visuals in my film outcomes. These materials are now also available online through the Holodomor Museum. My 5th film of 5 explores these materials. This is the film I produced first and is 1 minute 10 seconds long. Music for this project is by composer Yoni Collier. Production executive is Richard Gort, who's an industry partner. My third film of 5 is an interview exploring memories and materials from an interview with Philip Colley. Colley is great-nephew of journalist Gareth Jones. Jones travelled to Ukraine during Holodomor. His experiences and observations are critical accounts of this time and appeared in British newspapers. Quote, "To a certain extent, and for journalistic purposes, he betrayed that trust and got off the train and began walking along the railway lines, talking to peasants, observing what was happening in the collective farms." Colley describes materials from Jones's diary and family archives. These 2 images show maps from research work from Recipes for Baking Bread. One of Colley's questions about Jones's journey and route was if, as he only spoke Russian, was he speaking Russian to Russian peasants or Russian to Ukrainian peasants? It is known from his diaries he travelled to Belgorod and walked along train lines towards Ukraine. I mapped Jones's probable journey using existing data from Google Maps and materials from my interview with Colley from Jones's diary. These detail how long this journalist was walking for and his probable distances. From these maps, it is possible to see Jones was likely and almost certain to be in Ukraine as his experiences ended. I also mapped my own investigations and research. This image is a map of my journey to Ukraine for a residency in 2017 at the Holodomor Museum in Kiev. This research has funding from an Arts Council International Development Award from Arts Council England. These 6 images are visuals I created during my stay. These are responses to geographical maps from the Harvard Ukrainian Institute website. These maps show regional losses, political alliances, and collections of grains across Ukraine during Holodomor. This is preparation for my material for my final film, Outcomes. These materials appeared in exhibition at the Holodomor Museum in 2017, and curator for this project was Jana Grinko. My next section explores one scene of my final films. This is a star shot. It is about an imagination, poetic responses to materials, truth, fact, and fiction. I explore literature, poetry, and artistic references. One of these references is Rainer Maria Rilke's writings on Rodin's sculpture. Open quotes, "Its surroundings must be found within it," end quotes. Rilke describes movement, motion, and static objects. This is about worlds within artistic practice, physical objects, and audience responses to these worlds, how an artistic practice creates a world and immerses a viewer. I compare this quote with 13th century mystical poet Rumi. Open quotes, "From these stars like inverted candles, from these blue awnings of the sky, there has come forth a wondrous people, that the mysteries may be revealed," end quotes. Rumi's work explores mythical, magical, and spiritual approaches to artistic practice, to life, and to meaning. This is about action, doing, and practice. It is about what happens when conventional truth, data, and archival histories meet poetic responses, memories, and creative practice. This image shows source materials for Recipes for Baking Bread. This is an interactive HTML project. I map all source materials and show visual connections between these materials. It is possible for viewers to click on a source to jump to related materials. This is an accessible map of this project. In an exploration of truth, I cite Juan Mascaro in his introduction to Eastern Buddhist text, the Dhammapada. Open quotes, "The great task of man on earth is to see the real behind the appearance of waking dreams," end quotes. This is about inner truth, fictions, poetic justice, wisdom, archives, meanings, judgment, expression, and waking dreams. It is about collections of memories and independent personal stories. It is about exploring relationships between these stories, linking practices, and many meanings emerging from one set of circumstances. My final section is Recipes for Baking Bread. This is my practical PhD outcome, practice-based research in the form of 5 short films. These maps show an overview of my complete project. Each section is a response to an interview with an expert historian or somebody with a personal connection or relationship to Ukrainian histories. My first is a former baker, Jerry Pritulak. I interviewed Jerry on the eve of his Ukrainian bakery closing down. My second film is an interview with historian Serhii Plokhy. This is about using oral histories. My third is with Philip Colley, great-nephew of Gareth Jones, exploring Jones's work in Ukraine. My fourth is with scholar Daria Mattingly from the University of Cambridge. This section explores poetic truth and Mattingly's research into rank-and-file perpetrators from Holodomor. My final section is in a response to Jerry Berman's letters and my work with Alison Marshall. I have an introduction and outro with an interview with Ukrainian priest Volodymyr Sampara in Manchester. These images show visual representations of my bibliographies and source materials, drawings of books I read. This image is Svetlana Alexievich's collection of oral histories, Chernobyl Prayer, and another collection of her work, Second-Hand Time. I compare this with Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. These books felt similar to me, although one is factual account and another is fictional work. Grossman's English translation of Everything Flows or Forever Flowing. This contains 2 chapters exploring histories and memories from Holodomor. And David Shield's work, Reality Hunger. This is fragments of text exploring truth, reality, and fictions. This project includes technical work exploring film production techniques. This is a response to TV production and work I was creating in my former position as a designer at BBC Sport. This image is from a linking wipe from 2014. These are short 1-second animations to navigate viewers between current action and replays in sporting events. These are a common language in TV production and broadcasting. I created for Recipes for Baking Bread a wipe to navigate audiences between each film and between present-day experiences and 1930s Ukraine. My current work is disseminating and publicising this research. This includes film festivals. My most recent screening is a Ukrainian animation festival, Linoleum, and my next festival screening is the Edinburgh Short Film Festival in November 2022. This also includes distribution. This image is from a Swiss distribution platform, VDR Industry. This is by Swiss Film Festival, Vision du Reel. This image is an artist's website for these films. I'm collecting feedback for this project, and all responses, ideas, and suggestions are very welcome through feedback forms on this website. And now I will play my final films.
So Pascha, it's Resurrection Day. Pascha, it's bread. Eastern bread.
Many bakers have tried to copy it, but unsuccessfully because it is a secret recipe. It's closely guarded by the family. And they call it Bradford bread. Yes, as well, a lot of shops they did call our bread Bradford bread. But they're buying history. Divine history.
First of all, you have to collect as many different kind of sources as possible, and the only way to get to the reconstruction of what happened is by comparing those sources. And the way how to make it human is, I think, that the oral testimony is a really very important way of getting to the feelings of people, the experiences that they lived through. This is very helpful.
Well, at that time, journalists were prevented from travelling outside of Moscow, presumably because bad things were happening in the countryside and they didn't want it reported. He's meeting a lot of people who have stories of severe famine in other parts of the country, and he witnesses some aspects of this.
Sometimes it was, why I said it was a journey of discovery, it was difficult for me to discern the fiction from the actual, from the actual facts, especially when the families were mixed, because their children sometimes married each other, and sometimes there were dramatic twists of events, not short of Shakespearean plots of his plays. You could easily write a book about how the famine shaped lives not only of the victims but perpetrators' children for many, many years. And I'm not talking here about poetic justice. I'm talking more about how the long-lasting legacy of the famine in general, how it shaped people's lives, everyone's lives indeed.
А також служби і пам'яті рідних, що відійшли у вічність.
Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here, and I might have some issues with screen sharing. If possible, can you allow me to share my screen? It says it host disabled participant screen sharing. It's from my side. Yes, now it should work. So thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here among such interesting and very fascinating scholars. And with this research, I would like to bring some new focus to Holodomor studies and famine studies in general. And I would like to argue that by looking into material connections of famine survival, we might bring something new to the research on the Holodomor and famine studies in Ukraine and in general. So as you know, different famines of the 20th century and in Soviet Ukraine in particular of early 20s, early 30s and late 40s, they made a tremendous impact on economy, society, and material landscapes. And during each of those famines and the Holodomor of early 30s, they obtained more economic and important as they used to have earlier in the previous periods and some so-called normal periods. And while working with personal testimonies, recollections, published witness accounts, many of you have already noticed that we always have very similar stories about importance of material objects and materiality in general, different commodities and goods, and how they helped survive those years of hunger. So while in general famine studies are usually focused on eliminating different policies, methods, and intentions of authorities, with this research, I would like to argue that material dimensions of famines and their role of scenes should be also explored, and because they could bring some new focus to our understanding of these periods of humanitarian crises, social and political catastrophes. Being silent victims of these catastrophes, silent witnesses of this catastrophe and crimes against humanity, the material objects were instrumental for the survival of the hungry and remembering the experiences, allowing many those who survived to uncover their traumatic stories about the life and aftermath of the catastrophe. And in general, my research questions to understand how commodities and goods attained alternative meanings and became primary sources of survival during famines, to understand what was the impact of famines on power relations and material culture of Soviet and Ukrainian society. I'm also looking into in particular what kind of goods and objects became vitally important for person survival, and how did the meanings of everyday commodities evolve under such harsh circumstances. And this could help us to construct some collective biography of material objects of famine survival, and to explore this as a bigger topic in famine studies in general. And when I started to look into this topic, I found that there are much to be said about theory, and here you can see different approaches that I would like to bring into this study. They came from material culture studies, new materials sociology, new materials memory, and also this material turn in famine studies could bring some shift in understanding of the essential meaning of scenes during a survival crisis. Based on biography of scenes approach, it is important to shift our understanding from humans as victims, as those who were not unable to survive, but their actions and their activity with all of these things and materiality, it testify about their agency and willingness to survive. But also this shift from humans to wider animate environment could help us reconstruct collective biography of some items that were essential for survival, like jewelry, precious metals, household items, and this would help us to better understand all of these entanglements between material and immaterial, human and non-human. In fact, we are dealing here with power of materiality during famine. And by reading all of these numerous personal recollections and testimonies, we can see how on the verge of human existence, one particular material object became essential for survival of the whole family. Laura Auslander argues that understanding of material objects as active agents would help us to bring new shift in research. Also, Daniel argues that material scenes can enhance the capability of human beings even without their awareness of it. And deep connections of scenes with memory practices also could be important for understanding how famine experience is remembered, how famine survivors are finding the way how to tell about their stories, and usually these material scenes are important and instrumental for expressing their emotions, their memory, and recovering all of these stories about those traumatic events. As you can see from the slide, one of the slides mentions that people during the famine, I quote, carried everything valuable. Value is understood differently. For the state, it is a jewel for which it was possible to trade with other states. It was a way of making money. But for people, all of those things, they were essential for survival. And you can further read this quotation, and it's really very, very telling. But also looking into the materiality of Soviet famines and the Holodomor of early 30s in Ukraine in particular, we also have to acknowledge the special role, a special place of materiality in Soviet consumption ideology. If in the beginning of the early 20s we are dealing with anti-materialist communist ideology, we can see here that Soviet state and its institutes were critical of Vishism and Mishchanstvo, which were considered as a signs of excessive consumer behavior, and those who have some jewelry, furs, chocolates could be criticized and could be ostracized in Soviet society, and those goods were considered as wrongful commodities. But when the Soviet industry started to develop slowly light industry, we can see this industrial pragmatism of the early 30s as a new shift in consumer ideology. But in the Ukrainian context, this is much more complicated, because here we are dealing with a period of extreme starvation, of collectivization, decolonization, but also we can see here the appearance of new consumption spaces like the central department stores that appeared just in the mid of famine, like one in Kharkiv in 1933. So in general, famine experiences and food crises, they change consumption patterns in society, and radical changes in economy and emotional value of food and material objects became also a part of these new consumer shifts. And also We are dealing here with differences, extreme inequalities in the distribution of goods, of commodities, because we are dealing with rationing systems. And we can argue that here we might find a hierarchy of consumption, and different families belonging to different social groups have different material possessions, which was certainly important to acknowledge. And also, as you can see, I put here a quote from Anne Applebaum book. We can see here that those who survived the famines felt only not the trauma, but also loss for their scarce material belongings. I quote, objects they have received from their mothers, since they would have connected with them to their past, rings and jewelry they might have used or invented in another way, all of these were gone. And like people would tell the stories about their trauma, their loss, and their loss would be also connected to this scarce material possessions that were lost during this famine. It's also important to acknowledge that many of those people who survived this, the second famine, they already survived the first famine of early 20s. While in the early 20s, they were able to protect their material possessions like jewelry, some golden price or rings. In this second famine, they felt they have to give away it for bread, and later, like years ago, decades ago, they would argue about this as like big trauma for their families. So in general, material landscape during the famine of early 30s is also connected to this bigger processes around Soviet society, Ukraine, when we are dealing with industrialization, collectivization, and decolonization, grain and food requisition, food rationing, severe malnutrition and starvation. And we also need to acknowledge that in the countryside, we are dealing with scarce material possessions, and people usually have not a lot of things to trade or to exchange for bread, but still, like it is important that even those scarce material possessions, their scarcity became instrumental for survival. And in general, the materialist dimensions of famine survival are usually could be discussed with different objects, like here you can see on the slide, like gold and silver, money. So I mean golden money or silver money, jewelry, different rings, earrings, dishes and plates, some towels, some embroidery. Also, it could be pictures, some items of clothing. In fact, this could be different from family to family, but all of this could be usually ended up in toxins that appeared in early 30s, and were also this instrumental for materiality of survival. Also, certainly toxins were created by the state for specific purposes to extract the money and those valuables, but for survivals, they obtained another kind of alternative meanings, and certainly markets where people could exchange those material possessions for bread or some food. But in general, due to the limited influence of state industrialization on the life of ordinary citizens like peasants, especially in the countryside, we are dealing with scarce material possessions, like you can see here on the slides, where Mykola Bakan's family like is having their say dinner, in fact dinner without piece of bread. And you can see like how usually the interior of peasant house would look like, and actually not a lot of things could be found here. This quote is I think is very telling. This comes from one of the female survivors of the famine in Ukraine, when she is telling that broad of her mom helped their family to survive. And in fact, this story is very interesting because it tells about one item that were obtained as a dowry, as a brooch with 18 diamonds, which was often enrolled on the table and looked with admiration because it was like one of this very precious jewelry item in the family, and they try to protect it as long as possible. And here you can see how during the famine, the meaning of these items changed significantly. In general, we can see here from this research that turbulent circumstances change the essential meanings of things, especially gold, jewelry, and clothes, whether they were preserved, traded, stolen, or hidden, because all of these material possessions were always, people tried to protect. They were hidden in different places around the house or courtyard. These goods circulated, and somehow the circulation of these scarce material possessions, they saved many families from starvation and from dying. The possession of these things and utilization of material objects for everyday survival helped to resist state control over consumption, allowed people to prolong their lives, even if it was not successful at the end. But what is also interesting that how people would tell the stories about these items decades later after the famine, after the Holodomor. In fact, studying the testimonies of famine survivors with different approaches, like, for instance, text analysis instruments, it could allow us to examine different survival practices and to see, to understand how all of these material objects are interrelated, which of them were most important. And in one part of my research, I'm trying to study testimonies by using different digital methods. I can see from this research that together with famine, food, and waste, material objects and things, they played a vital role in the life-saving strategies of the hungry, of the starving. And as the memories of survivors would tell us, many owners felt deep emotional connections, attachment to these objects, and they consequently related their survival stories, narratives to the objects, like half of the wedding ring or mom's brooch. And as a result, we can see how all of these objects became some kind of deep individual repositories of survival, of their experiences. And they are also very connected with emotions of those family and survivals. So in fact, shifting a little bit the focus from human agency, from humans to their material possessions, we can expand our understanding of this intensity of these difficulties of survival, these catastrophic events of survival, the starvation, and could enlarge our understanding of famine in general. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm also looking forward for your questions and discussions.
Dear colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this conference. And John and Daria, thank you very much for perfect organization of this conference. And I'd like to represent a bit different angle of the Holodomor, but it's still in the context of the global perspective of the Holodomor research. And I'd like to suggest clinical psychological approach to the Holodomor. And every time when we are talking about trauma, we could mention 3 levels. It could be about person, individual, and then we are talking about personality trauma. Also, it could refer family stories, family narratives, and in this case, we are talking about family trauma. And sometimes trauma refers to cultures, nations, ethnicities, and in this case we are talking about cultural, collective, community, historical traumas. And it's interesting fact that when we are talking about genocide trauma, it's always about all these 3 levels. It's always about personal, it's always about family, and it's always about cultural and community trauma. It's like, I like this metaphor, like hourglass, and 2 ends, one end is individual, another one is cultural, and this end is just passed through family traditions, representations, narratives. And I'd like to thank the Holodomor Research and Education Center because it was funded and we did this research within this grant. And also I'd like this idea of Elie Wiesel that we have no right just to forget about our past and do not tell our future generation about our past. And if we just do not talk about people and we just forget our dead, we allow them to die for a second time. And the idea of our research, then when we are listening to witness, we become witnesses. So I should say that we are witnesses, all of us are witnesses for these 2 days. And the aim of our research is to extend our understanding of intergenerational transmission of genocide trauma, and specifically to examine intergenerational effects of the Holodomor 1932-1933 in Ukraine on the 2nd and 3rd generations of women. And why did we choose a women approach? There are some evidence for it. First of all, Jacob suggested these gender-specific traumas and gender-specific approach to collective and genocide trauma. And there are some gender-specific kinds of traumas like killing or abandoning children, sexual assault or reproductive abuse, and only women could talk about these traumas and could express their emotions about these traumas. Another point is by Newmark that genocide is always misogynistic and directed predominantly at women, since they are the cultural and biological repository of nation. Another one that women are the main translators of family stories, and if we are talking about some family traditions, some family histories, it's always about women and their translation, these stories from one generation to another one. And there is a lot of evidence that women are the most vulnerable population during the war, during the genocide, and there are not only biological but social perspectives. And for example, there is recent research about the war in Kosovo, the conflict in Kosovo, and the authors demonstrate that when, for example, injured men are met with pride and support from the community, sexually assaulted women are met with rejection and with shame. So there are a lot of evidence which makes women are the most vulnerable population in this military conflict or genocide. And about our participants, we had 2 female sampling groups, a sample of the mothers group and the daughters group. So mothers, it was the 2nd generation, and daughters group was the 3rd generation. And inclusion criteria for sampling were being female and above 18 years old and having a family experience of the famine, 1932-1933. So there were a total 20 women participated, 10 women in each focus group, mothers and daughters. And it's very important, why did we choose the second, why we have chosen the second and the third generations. And there is idea by Bifulka that the third generation, as a rule, is the most proactive in searching for truth, in searching past stories in the family. And of course, when we did this research 3 years ago, there were practically no alive the Holodomor survivors, and we could work only with the second and the third generations. So we suggested some questions. There were 7 questions. What experience have you had linked to the period of the Holodomor? How does the Holodomor affect you personally in general? Given the Holodomor experience is greatly traumatic, what is the Holodomor impact on your sense of self, on your physical and mental health, well-being? How does the Holodomor affect your family, your relations with your family? How does the Holodomor affect your work and professional growth? What events, people, or themes associated with the Holodomor have you discussed with your descendants? And of everything we have talked about, what are the most important to you? And we use the inductive thematic analysis from description to interpretation. It means that we didn't assume or predict some themes beforehand. All themes erased from our interpretation and from our analysis. And there were 2 experts, and then we did some correlation analysis between their codes, yes, and we have chosen only codes which were statistically significant. So there were some themes, and I'd like to tell about them in details. So the first theme is emotions and feelings, and the most expressed emotions are anger, fear, sufferings, and pain. We expected that there should be some moral emotions connected with the violation of some moral rules or moral principles, but we didn't find these emotions, and all emotions just were connected with the anger, sufferings, and fear. For example, I accepted all these memories easily when I was a small girl and did not realize how it was possible to live without food. However, growing up, my easiness transformed into great anger toward the Soviet government, which made my family suffer and die. If I took a machine gun, I would kill the entire government which was responsible for Holodomor victims. The next theme is attitudes towards food and starvation, and there are some codes: body sensations, respect for bread, overeating, preoccupation with food. For example, his legs swelled up and his mother used the lost chestnuts to make flour. My grandmother said that we shouldn't throw away any piece of bread, instead to eat, to share with somebody, or to feed pets or birds, but not to waste. The next category, the next theme, is sense of loss and death. For example, my husband's mother survived physically during the Holodomor, but she is still injured mentally. So my husband also felt mentally distressed. Or in our village, there are individual graves for Holodomor victims with wooden crosses in every home yard or between them, because people were too weak to bury them in village cemetery. Then transgenerational transmission of trauma in family narratives, and we found 2 ways to talk and opposite to avoid. For example, nobody knew that this place was a grave until an old woman pointed to it. She kept the secret because it was unsafe to talk about it earlier. Or I didn't know that my grandfather had died of starvation. Nobody told me about it. I just thought that I had never had a grandfather. Or my grandmother never spoke to me about the Holodomor. The only person who talked to me about it was my mother. Another theme is ethnic identity, and even now during this Russia-Ukraine war, we could see this rise of ethnic identity in Ukrainians, and we could observe it in narratives connected with the Holodomor. For example, the Soviet government hated everything significant for Ukrainians and was directed towards the destruction of Ukrainian nationalism. Talking about the Holodomor now is emphasizing that I am Ukrainian and I will protect everything which is significant for Ukrainians. Or disclosing the truth of the Holodomor means a change of my worldview, the awareness that I was fed up with the lie about our history, and I need to know facts about the new history of Ukraine without Soviet propaganda. And yesterday somebody mentioned about coping strategies, and yeah, we defined some codes, some different strategies, coping strategies with trauma in the Ukrainian interviews, but the most important of them, just not to forget, just to tell, to speak about it. And it is of crucial importance to teach Holodomor history at schools, to share the truth about Holodomor events in the world on the one hand, and to relieve the pain of Ukrainians, and on the other hand, to prevent such genocide in future. We have shared the truth of the Holodomor with the world since it was hidden from people by the Soviet government. And by the way, the responses for the last question, what is the most important, do you consider in our interview, people as a rule told that it's very important just to talk about it, just to have an opportunity to discuss all these events. And we also found some differences in offspring narratives of the second and the third generations. And we confirmed the idea of Bifulka that the daughters express more preparedness for sharing traumatic experience, their narratives are longer and more detailed, and their relations with their own children were affected by more securely attachment style. And mothers tended to distance themselves from intimacy with their daughters and try to avoid the detailing of the traumatic narratives. So we still consider that the third generation is the most proactive in searching the true stories about the past. And why is it important to examine, to explore now what are the practical implications of this research? First of all, we have no collective trauma-focused interventions. We have individual-focused interventions, we have community-focused interventions, but we have now some practical interventions with collective cultural historical trauma. So we consider that this research has some practical implications, and if we know a lot of genocide trauma, we could suggest some interventions how to cope with it effectively. And it's important because trauma is always intrusion of the past into the present. All traumas are in the past, but all symptoms of trauma are now in the present. And that's why it's very important to examine the genocide examine genocide traumas, because we descendants, a direct descendant, I'm direct descendant of the Holodomor survivors. So direct descendants still have some, how to say, shades or, of this trauma or effects of this trauma. And I'd like to present a very brief piece of this research, of the current research. We just collect data in civilian population which are affected by the Russia-Ukraine war. And you see this dark blue column is people who had the Holodomor in their family stories. And the first criteria is PCL, is measurement for assessment PTSD. And you can see that people who had this traumatic story in their family, who experienced in their family the Holodomor, they have higher indices for PTSD in this war. We didn't publish this result yet, but we are interpreting them and try to explain it, because it's interesting, because people who experience the Holocaust, they have now this predisposition to PTSD. It's our team, and I'd like to express acknowledgement to all our team for this research, and we have some publications on this topic, and thank you for your attention.
Oops. Can everybody see my, I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for this interesting conference. And I regret not being there in person. We were going to leave on a Wednesday, and on Tuesday we had a family emergency and we had to cancel our trip to the UK. One of the consequences of that is it's 2 o'clock in the morning Arizona time. So I'm hoping you'll be tolerant of any incoherence that I have. Okay. President Andrasky talked about peasants as the ghosts who silently haunt our work, and points out that there's no systematic study of strategies people use to survive the Holodomor. And I'm hoping she can point out whether that's still true after all these years, or it has been helped to be ameliorated. What I want to look at is what people do. What are some of the survival strategies during food shortages? What's the agency of the afflicted? Unfortunately, the popular image tends to be near skeletons, passively waiting for death or help, and unfortunately, it's often the former. And that's true when people are at that level of starvation. But if you look at the history, if you look at the progress of starvation, people early on have a lot of strategies they used to try to deal with it. There are the anticipatory actions, which we are familiar with. That's what people do just to make sure that they are economically secure. But most importantly, more interesting are the mitigating actions that people take. And there are a wide range of these things like migration, demographic change, selling valuables, which Iryna just talked about, children, and selling themselves, or prostitution, a whole variety of things. And for the end of this talk, I want to focus on increased consumption of alternative foods, which is my interest. These three papers are very, very different, but I think there's a commonality that they recognize the critical link between cultural and behavioral issues, the material, particularly lack of food, and memory. And most importantly, they focus on those affected, not on government policies, not on demography, not on political economy, but on the people that are actually affected. So I want to make a very few comments about these presentations, and I have some questions. And then I want to extend the discussion, if we have time, for a very different view of a global perspective. Instead of looking at how the Holodomor can be understood by its international context, I'm going to argue that the Holodomor, or actually any other food shortage or famine, can help us understand and be useful for people throughout the world, a global perspective. So it'll be a little different approach. I hope you hold with me. Okay, recipes for baking bread. I haven't seen the films, I just saw them with you, so I really don't want to make a lot of comments. I do think that use of cartographic regression to understand landscape transformations is really very interesting. And boy, the film about Gareth Jones, who was so important in the English-speaking world to bring the truth of the Holodomor to people, is very, very valuable. I don't have a lot of specific comments. I want to use this as an opportunity, however, to talk about survivor recollections. I've read a lot of these, not just for this particular famine, but for a lot of other famines. And they're very important for the emotional connection and understanding people's lives and what it meant to them. It is important for the audience, and I suspect it's important for the survivors as well. This is true for videos, and it's also true for written recollections. For example, that wonderful book, The Black Deeds of the Kremlin. And these unstructured narratives are really valuable. But for those of us who are trying to get information about what people do during famines, structured interviews would be very, very useful. Asking follow-up questions, and I'll talk about how that is in the future. So many of these interviews are unstructured, emotionally important, but if you want to get information about famines and how people cope with famines and deal with famines and adapt to famines, more structured interviews that can follow up and ask more detailed questions would be very, very useful. Now, it may be a moot point, you think, for the Holodomor, but some evidence with studies of the Angorta or the Irish potato famine has shown that there's information passed down through generations, as we just heard. And so you can talk to the descendants as well. Now, there's a very minor point here, which I find fascinating because I'm interested in food use during famines, and that is the title of recipes for bread. Almost every time you listen to or read about survivors' stories, they don't talk about we're lacking food. They frame it in terms of a sort of a currency of anxiety, and it usually is a staple. Oh my God, we're out of rice, or we don't have sweet potatoes, or in the case of most Eastern European famines, we're out of bread. And so having bread in the title is most appropriate. Materialities of famine. I'm an archaeologist and ethnobotanist. And we archaeologists love the material. In fact, we depend on the material culture to tell us about people's lives. And so I'm very, very fascinated by this interesting approach of using data from basically a state monopoly pawn shop system to people selling valuables, which is a very common survival strategy. And we wish her well with her exciting dissertation research. Often, as an archaeologist, and I don't know if it's the same for historians, it's often good to have several different independent studies to see if they come to the same conclusion, in this case, selling valuables. And so it would be interesting, I think, for her, I would suggest, if she can, to look at the role of black markets, which I know would be hard in a Soviet state with a great deal of repression, or even informal barter as secondary measures of selling valuables. Sort of a state monopoly versus an alternative economy. And I can't imagine there isn't a black market. I haven't read about any famine where there wasn't black market or informal bartering among people. And it would give us a fuller understanding of how people sell valuables to live. Another thing is to look at police records of theft of valuables. Another way to acquire valuables is, frankly, theft. And my guess is there's actually probably pretty good police records about theft of valuables. Another way of looking at how people acquire and dispose of valuable items to sell, which again is a very major, as was pointed out, a very major survival strategy. And third, I would suggest following the money and examine variations in strategies of selling, looking at by class. Presumably there are very good records that the pawn shop, the retail network kept records of who was selling, and look by class and look by region, etc., to see where the goods are coming from. And if there is, where is the capital that is generated from these goods going? Is it going to regional areas? Is it going to the Soviet area? What is it? So there are lots of follow-ups in this that are very exciting, and I think might extend the look at just the pawn shops to get a fuller understanding of how valuables are used. Lost and found, forgotten mother-daughter stories. This has a great intellectual foundation and methodological structure. It is so outside my area of expertise, I don't want to comment on it. But I want to mention a couple of logical steps. I'm not sure I agree with the fact that women have a greater burden during famines than males. I think they're different. And therefore, I'd like to know if there are comparative studies of mother-son, father-daughter, or father-son studies to learn about transgenerational psychotrauma effects that are in general, as well as those that are gender-specific. So those are logical follow-ups. Also, and I don't follow this work terribly closely, but there is incredibly interesting work, particularly out of the Dutch hunger season in 1944, looking at physical and even genetic effects on subsequent generations of famine. There have been studies, for example, of people that were in utero during the 1944s and the kinds of health effects they have. And there are even some human and experimental genetic studies suggesting that the prolonged food shortages actually have genetic changes that can be passed on through generations. And so it would be wonderful to see both the psychological and the social, as Larysa was talking about, combined with the physical and the genetic, to really get a more holistic understanding of the effects of famines across generations. This may have happened, I don't know, and I'd love to know that. Now, here's that different take. I'm going to focus on what is the most essential material in famines, that is foodstuffs. Let's start with what we know. We know famines are quite common in the past. Thousands have been recorded, and they are currently occurring today, unfortunately. And that the use of alternative foods or famine foods have saved millions, and I would suggest even tens of millions of lives over millennia. It's a major adaptive strategy, survival strategy. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that famines likely will occur in the future. I think that's probably fair. We just have to look at the current Russian aggression in Ukraine and see what potential effects it could have had if grains hadn't been able to, or Ukrainian grains haven't been able to get out into countries that depended on them. And that if that's the case, there are famines in the future and famine foods in the past were important. My guess is they're going to be life-saving for the future. So let's get back to the Ukraine. Ukraine has a diverse flora. There are over 16,000 plant species known. You can see vascular plants, fungi, molds, and algae, all of which to a degree can be edible. I didn't put bryophytes in because I don't know if anybody eats bryophytes. So Ukraine has a very, very diverse flora. And I looked at, and I have two tables of food that are recognized, plant foods that are used in a lot of the ethnobotanical literatures on Western Ukraine in Polish. And I got about 25 plants that I think I can identify pretty clearly. And at the bottom of each category, there are things like moldy distillery mash, seeds, and human feces. They're obviously plants, but you can't figure out what they are. And you can see there's a range of things that are used. What bothers me about this, I don't see wheat, or I didn't get any in the information I looked at, wheat and sunflower, which suggests that this is incomplete. So if there's somebody who knows Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish, I think you could really extend this. I looked at videos from the Ukrainian diaspora, and as well as various books and survivor narratives. And then there are things like trees, herbaceous plants, and other things like these invented foods, like a millet chaff, molasses and bean pulp mix. And so you see there are lots of different variety of plants that are used. There are about 25 that I think I could identify pretty well, which is a small number considering there are 16,000. There are probably a lot more out there. But if you look at the types of plant famine foods, and here are 10 major categories, and just a small preliminary list of famine food used during the Holodomor, you can see there are 7 of the 10 categories. And so there's a wide ranging use of famine food, plant famine foods. And I would probably include relief supplies, but I don't exactly understand. Even in like the Great Leap Forward famine, where is very much like what the Soviet Russia did to Ukraine, the Chinese government did have a process and to try to find alternative foods and to ameliorate the famine. And it doesn't look like there's anything that for the Ukraine, but I really don't know the specifics. If that's the case, then that's just a very, very strong argument, added argument to the fact that this was genocide and not just a famine. So even this very limited preliminary data set for plant use during the Holodomor shows a wide range of different plants. Tabooed plants, I didn't find any evidence of tabooed plants being used, or unknowns or mimic plants. So anyway, but the point is there's just a lot of 7 of 10, 70% of these categories are represented in this very small data set. You can even compare it to a worldwide sample. And these are percentages of things like fruits, seeds, et cetera. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, but this, and this data is very, very preliminary, but you can see that the Holodomor leaves and greens and seeds are used far less than in the worldwide sample, and other, which I think is a lot of chaff, and other is used more commonly. And that's not surprising because even though it's a worldwide average, there's enormous variability regionally. And so you can compare this worldwide and worldwide perspective, which is useful. So what and what to do? Well, what I've argued in the past is that famine foods are a backup. They're sort of the last gasp to protect people from starvation. And there are literally probably tens of thousands of plants that have been known to be famine food. The Kew Garden has a list of 28,000 medicinal plants. I can't imagine that the number of known famine foods in the world is anything less than the number of medicinal plants. So we're talking tens of thousands, I would think. The largest database on famine foods worldwide has 1,700. And this information is useful because, we're going to have famines in the future and this may keep people alive. So having a list and knowing what foods are edible is insurance for the future. The good news is there's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge out there. People have been living off the land for millennia and they understand it and they know what's edible and what's not edible. The other good news is doing this kind of research is dirt cheap. Compare it to astronomy. How many billions of dollars or how many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to hit an asteroid with a spaceship, a satellite? Good thing, important thing, but it's expensive. This kind of research is really cheap and inexpensive. The bad news is this knowledge, I think, is very easily lost because it's not used on a daily basis. And I think there's some evidence that this kind of knowledge is easily lost over generations. So it needs to be gathered as quickly as possible. And again, for the Holodomor, it may be moot because there are probably very, very few survivors left. But what is needed and what doesn't happen is you need a collaboration of different people, biologists, social scientists, historians, folklorists, and local community. One of the problems in reading about famines and trying to get information on famine foods is historians and ethnographers will say, well, they ate grass and weeds. That's not useful. And a biologist can help try to understand what grass and weeds there are. Biologists, when they talk about famine foods, tend to be very specific about what species it is, but not very specific about its cultural context. And so what really works best is a collaboration between biologists, social scientists, historians, even folklorists and local communities. If you want to see how this works, there is this article, relatively recent article on the Dutch hunger season in 1944. It's a collaboration of social scientists and biologists on what the Dutch used during the hunger season in 1944, which is a fairly short and limited, 25,000 people dying. And by 20th century standards, that's fairly low unless you're one of those 25,000. And it's an amazing piece of work. Not only did they go through archives and diaries and survivors' narratives, those sorts of things to get lists, but they also talked to survivors 71 years after the hunger winter. And they got some really interesting information about how memory of food use is. That's very, very useful. And if you want to read it, I got that book, Famine Foods, you could read about it. But if you want a model of what is the best, to me, the best study of famine food use is this study out of the Netherlands for the Dutch hunger season. Now, this is just one thing, famine foods is what I'm interested in, but almost any other kind of coping strategy, a cross-cultural perspective on different coping strategies like selling goods has value, I think, for the future. And so we need to understand the Holodomor, but also it's useful to use how that helps us understand about human behavior under these extreme conditions. Thank you very much, and I turn it back to the moderator, and so people can ask questions. Thank you for your attention.
Would the speakers like to address the comments by the discussant?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your comments and your feedback on my work. It's fascinating and one of the references I don't have. So I was really interested in this sort of theme throughout all of the presentations and what Paul picked up on about individuals. And one of the reasons I love Svetlana Alexievich, whose work I showed in my presentation, is she uses autoethnographic research methods in writing to conduct oral history interviews. And she inserts herself and her own experiences into these interviews in a very subtle way, just using italics in her text. And it's a way of really declaring and exposing the human realities of any kind of conversation or data collection or any kind of research. So I was really heavily inspired by that and thought a lot about individual stories, gaps in memories, gaps in histories that you also mentioned. Iryna mentioned Anne Applebaum's quote relating to objects and loss of material goods during Holodomor, and I also use this same quote in my written thesis. So the idea of memories, which relates to my ideas of recipes, so recipes being passed down through generations, and what happens when there are gaps in memories and stories. I was also really interested in the idea of narrative and narrative structures. And again, going back to literature, I looked at an 18th century novel by Lawrence Sterne called Tristram Shandy, and the idea of disrupted narratives. So in terms of information collecting data, but also how I present information. So of course in film, this is manifest in processes of editing. But also I looked at a lot of literature, for example, the way that Tolstoy uses what he describes as architecture in his work. So designing a structure which allows stories to appear within a very kind of framed structural narrative. I was also really pleased for your comment on the title of my project. I wanted to create something that was really mainstream, and I've had really good feedback on the title, and that's led in a very direct way to commissions. I worked on a feature film earlier this year in another area, but I've created something hopefully that is accessible to a mainstream audience as well as specific academic audiences. Thank you.
Larysa?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Paul. It's a very good idea about holistic approach to transgenerational transmission of trauma, and of course we use this biopsychosocial methodology and we take into account biological factors. We know, yes, there are research of epigenetics of trauma. I think it's not feasible for us because it's a bit not our field of research, but definitely what we are doing, there is research that the representatives of the second generation have a predisposition for diabetes too. It was found by researchers from US, and we try to continue our research, and we, as a clinical psychologist, I examine people who have celiac disease and gastrointestinal problems. So I mean people who has to keep to a lifelong diet. And we assume that people who has this trauma in the family story, the trauma of Holodomor, have a great difficulties in relations with food, and it's very difficult for them to keep to a diet. It's our hypothesis, and we just do the study with people, with patients with these diagnoses. It's a very good idea. Thank you.
Iryna?
Yes, thank you so much, Paul, for your very inspiring comments and for your support of my research. And in fact, your comments kind of helped me to see my project in a much bigger context. And I have already looked to your recently published book on famine foods and plants, and it's really fascinating study and global overview of different survival strategies. And in fact, my research is also focused on not only on material culture of survival, but also consumption practices and environment. And your comments and the vision how to develop this research is really really helpful. And with regarding local knowledge, ecological knowledge about different plants and foods, like also animals that became edible during years of hunger, it's really important to address that like people who survived this famine, they have really understanding of what was edible and was not, and this knowledge is very important. Also, many of cases of poisonings were there, but still many people managed to survive due to this knowledge about the environment and edible products and foods and animals. And with regard to my research on your comments on my presentation today, I am very grateful that you pointed out to some perspective areas that I could have a look, and in particular sources that could be available for this focus of research. And yes, I have this also idea to follow the money, as you mentioned, but in a different kind of wording. Like I was hoping to examine movements of material objects and trace them through different kind of map, construct some kind of GIS map, and see from what region to like how these objects are moving from one region to another. And with this, as you also acknowledge, we can see the differences and inequalities and hierarchies even between regions in Kharkiv, within Ukrainian Republic, and between different republics, because those material objects moved from like rural areas to big cities, and then from also from Ukrainian Republic to Moscow. And we can see how like all of this interrelations and inequalities are also seen through the movements of these material objects of survival. And the idea is to look to police records is really useful, and I would definitely have a look at this corpus of sources, but at the moment it is not available, but I would like also to somehow get more understanding about this as well. So thank you so much, Paul, for your very inspiring comments, and I would look forward for other comments and questions.
Yeah, we would like now to take questions from the audience.
My question is to see your films. My question relates to whether or not and to what extent you looked at the Jones diaries when Nigel Colley and I were transcribing those 1933 diaries. We did encounter difficulties in finding someone who could translate the passages which ultimately were translated by Alan Richard here in Cambridge. And second part of my question, whether or not, again, to what extent the previous documentaries done about Jones influenced, what you wanted to say about him.
Thank you. I looked to some extent at Jones's diaries online, and the enormous archive that Nigel Colley, when he was alive, created this enormous web repository of Jones's materials. The final outcome that I created was mainly based on my interaction with Phil Colley and his interpretation of Jones as a character and the stories that surrounded Jones, both during his life and after his death. So I didn't focus on Jones's diaries so much. I also became really fascinated by Gareth Jones, while he was in Ukraine, collected posters and visual ephemera of his time there. And although the work that he was doing surrounding Holodomor was obviously absolutely critical from a visual perspective, there's also an enormous archive of visual materials that were just found in his room. But some of those archival materials, some of those posters really heavily influenced the visual appearance of my film. So I was very inspired by those. And of course, I read the newspaper reports and the materials that are available online. In answer to your second question, no, I haven't watched that documentary. So Phil Colley gave me some resources that, I have watched the documentary. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. The book I haven't read. The documentary did influence me in ways that I wasn't expecting. So I watched the documentary, and I also spoke to Phil Colley about it. And there were very mixed responses from the family about how the filmmakers had used those materials with and without consulting the members of the family. And I was very aware that I didn't want to do the same things with the work I was creating, and I wanted to give Collie his own voice. And with all of the people I interviewed, I wanted to allow all the contradictions to exist and try not too much to put my own ideas and influence on top of that. So I think that particular film that you're referring to, I think is a fantastic piece of mainstream Hollywood production. I think it's incredible. It really erased the profile of Holodomor, and I think that's fantastic. I also think it has to be taken as a piece of storytelling. And while some of the things in the film did happen, they may not have happened specifically to Jones. And I think it's important to see that as a piece of storytelling and filmmaking rather than a piece of truthful documentary narrative, and to see all of the implications of that.
Hi, I have also a question for Sara. Thank you for this presentation. I think that this is an amazing project. And I really, what I liked the most was the kind of polyphony of voices that you introduced to your story. So, you know, there are testimonies, there are memoirs, there's literature, there are your interviews, there's your own positionality. So I think that it's absolutely brilliant in the way you kind of did it. And my question, I mean, because I also very much appreciate this kind of knowledge visualization experiments. And I was also trying to experiment in my doctoral research with the Harvard MAPA project, but I was not really even close to the kind of sophisticated level of your, of your work. So my question is really about, representations and this polyphony of voices. And the question would be about the gender dimension in your project, because I was thinking, if we think about making bread and we're thinking about how we call it, recipes for baking bread, I'm thinking initially about this kind of very domestic sphere that to some extent was dominated by women. And there is this gesture in your film about kneading the bread. I think that this is the way it calls. So I was thinking whether you were thinking about this kind of female domestic space and in this kind of processes of making bread. And it also kind of, brings me closer to questions, in the Holodomor testimonies, in the Holodomor memoirs, there's also this kind of very interesting, a gender dimension of women being those who are kind of struggling to create food out of nothing. So I think that there is something to be said about this gendered part. And last but not least, I was also thinking about your stories of Gareth Jones, and I was immediately thinking about Ria Kleiman, so the Canadian journalist who also had this trip on Ukraine. And I was thinking, to what extent her representation of famine is different, just because her positionality as a female is different than Gareth Jones. So I don't know, some thoughts about the gendered logic.
Thank you so much for your comments and your feedback. I love what you said about polyphonic voices. This is really important to me. I did a lot of work researching Mikhail Bakhtin's ideas of polyphonic voices in literature and how I can do that with visual language and also with audio interviews as well, and the layering and allowing different parts of my research all to speak concurrently, even when there are contradictions or even conflicts between them. Yes, I love the Harvard MAPA project. That was really inspiring, the use of geographies to tell stories. And your ideas of representation, so I love the way that you described it, and I hadn't thought about it in those succinct terms. So obviously after seeing Larysa's presentation as well, and the idea of mothers and daughters and the gendered narrative, which obviously does exist. One of the things I did early in my project is I was looking at Carl Jung's idea of archetypes. I was trying to find ways of introducing character into my films without doing it in a sort of Disney style, creating character sort of way. And Jung has 4 archetypes. One of those archetypes is the mother. And according to Jung, the mother can be represented by objects, by material objects. And one of those objects is the oven, as a kind of maternal caregiver, a metaphor for giving life, for feeding. But also when I did some research into traditional Ukrainian ovens, the stove as a part of family history and as part of domestic life, it is something that's so important. Some of my research actually suggests that it was critical in terms of how stories and even narrative and language developed. So some of the scenes in my films are drawings of traditional Ukrainian ovens, and that's a reference to all of these things, to the idea of something maternal, to the idea of stories, narratives, recipes, and what stoves did in Russian and Ukrainian culture and how often they appear in literature, and in literature in both research and in fiction. There are many examples of people, for example, sleeping on the kind of family stove and the stove being central to family and cultural life. So in that respect, those elements are in my film, but it's not as explicit as very definite and succinct research, but it's something that definitely was in my mind and definitely was in my research and the drawings that I created.
Thank you. I believe we have time just for one more question.
Thank you so much. I'm Serhiy Kelchik from the University of Victoria. About Iryna's paper, I was fascinated by this attempt to use this new materiality approach to the memory of the Holodomor. What has occurred to me, and I wanted to ask Iryna's opinion on that, is that some of these objects may be said to be precisely non-material because they don't really exist. They exist as a memory. So I think conceptually they would be different from the objects that are existing in the present and thus represent a memory, become a symbol of the event while they maintain physical existence. But some of your examples, very interesting ones, are actually about the jewelry and such, in fact, of the objects that are gone, right? So how would you conceptualize various categories of objects included in your research? And very quickly on Sara's, I wanted to ask about your use of colors and music. I've been actually thinking about what you are representing there, also given that you have black and white sequences too, like the books are black and white, but the rest are in colors and the music. And if I were to say what my immediate reaction to the color schemes and musical element would be, that would be the theme of history, perhaps. But perhaps it's something else for you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Serhiy, so much for your interesting comment. You actually captured one of the most important thing about material objects of famine survival. And in fact, like when you are looking into the to this question, you actually see as a problem, like which I encountered in the beginning, how to study something that it is not there, we cannot see, we cannot access to it like physically, but it is in the memory, in the this recollections of survivors. Like how to like get closer to these objects. Like basically, we are also dealing here with something that is not even visible for us. Something is not material, not physical, and with this different material culture approaches, I believe it's possible at least to get closer to these objects, even they are lost for us. And it is another problem that those objects are both lost for these people, for these families, and they are lost for scholars. In fact, when we are going to There is another problem with these material objects of famine and the Holodomor in particular. When we are going to museum collections, we do not have a lot of material objects. How there is another question, how to present the history of this period, like what objects are possible to use to like with this representation of this period. And here we are dealing with a bigger problem, like because all of these objects could be lost, they could be confiscated, they could be traded, stolen, like various stories with these objects. They could be sent, they are moving also with people or on their own through the stock scene system or black market. Different networks are like also taking part here, but basically the problem here with examining this materiality of famine survival is that we do not have access to these objects in most cases, and that's why our methods of research also like should be more inventive in order to see like how to give the voice to these objects and how to recover these experiences of survival. And actually, it is not unique problem with the famine in Ukraine, because historians of hunger winter also dealing with the same problem, and basically they also doing very similar research. And just recently there was a conference on famines in European history, and one of the scholars made a presentation on different monuments to food in hunger winter, and one of them was food placards, like like signs about food parcels that were dropped out to the earth during the hunger winter. But actually we do not see this food, but it was there at some point during the famine. So like with this invisibility of material objects, like I think it's something that it is problematic, but at the same time it tells a lot about this period and period of survival, and also like Soviet context. Basically, it's also very important because as I pointed out, we are dealing with critiques towards materiality, but at the same time during the famines in Soviet Ukraine, and in particular in early 30s, with the successive requisitions, we are dealing with the problem that material objects obtain much bigger importance for survival and for family and also for state. Thank you so much. Sorry if my comment was too long.
Can I add a comment as well? Because the paragraph that Iryna and Sara cited in their presentation, there is a bit background to that. It was in a conversation with Anna Polban and myself, and she asked me a question: what happened to all that gold and silver and jewelry procured by Torksin? Where did it go? And it seems an obvious question, to which I answered, it should have been melted because USSR was exporting gold, and according to Zasiekina, it peaked export of gold in 1933, which funded industrialization. So Anna replied to that, so there is nothing left. Well, we know some jewelry was appropriated, but in effect, it made Ukrainian peasants and now collective farmers no different from other Soviet collective farmers, and took memory away. And I know she didn't include that in the book, but conversation went on to say it was part of cultural genocidal practice, along with removal of memorials and different monuments and churches. So we can see that as genocidal practice as well. So Iryna's research has wide implications, and thank you all participants of this panel. It was a great discussion. And just before we go for coffee break, I know several of delegates are departing in the afternoon, so I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to have a conference photo on this stage with everyone present in the audience. Would you mind making your way to the stage, and we will take a photo.